People really want to become homeowners.
Today's home buyer, they're likely the child of someone who may have lost their home during the housing crisis.
The gap in homeownership between Black and white communities is greater today than it was when the Fair Housing Act was adopted in 1968. Where do you see the most urgent threats and opportunities in expanding sustainable home ownership for communities of color, particularly Black communities? Well, hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Demetria McCain. I serve as the Director of Policy at the Legal Defense Fund. LDF, as we call it, has spent the past 85 years fighting for racial justice, including economic justice. And today we are talking about home ownership and fair housing. And I am joined by Julienne Joseph, home ownership expert and former HUD Chief of Staff and Biden-Harris appointee who worked under Secretary Marcia L. Fudge, where she led cross-agency strategic initiatives. So today, Julienne's actually founder and principal of JYJ Consulting, a housing policy and finance firm that delivers strategic policy and regulatory guidance, as well as housing finance advisory services. So listen, all that being said, let's just jump right in, because the gap in homeownership between Black and white communities is greater today than it was when the Fair Housing Act was adopted in 1968. Where do you see the most urgent threats and opportunities in expanding sustainable home ownership for communities of color, particularly Black communities, today?
So it's hard to pick just one, but we know that there are several barriers to home ownership that impact Black and brown communities. First of all, we know generational wealth is at the top of the list. We know that it takes money in order to get into a home. And considering the fact that, a lot of the folks who are becoming homeowners at this day and time, they are first generation folks who are, gainfully employed, some of which are just tipping the six-figure mark in metropolitan cities. So with that being said, even though they are higher wage earners than their parents, considering the increase in cost of living, there is a presumption in a lot of housing finance that just because people are making a lot of money doesn't mean that they've had the opportunity to save. So just because someone is making six figures for the first time doesn't mean that they've saved up enough in order to meet the minimum requirement in order to purchase a home. Of course, where we used to serve, Demetria, over at HUD, FHA's down payment is 3.5%. But everybody knows that home sales prices are extremely high. Yeah. The average house is about $300,000 in the FHA portfolio. So if you take that into consideration, you can do the math that finding 3.5% on a $300,000 house is a lot of money for someone who doesn't have assistance, some of which have to end up tapping into some form of retirement in order to meet that minimum requirement and investment in order to buy a house. So I think that that is the first thing. And the threat to that, to answer the second part of your question, is the fact that down payment assistance is under attack. And, for those folks in Black communities whose parents can't stroke a check to help them with that down payment, that is a major barrier. And the more that we hear that there's resistance on the Hill in order to provide down payment assistance, I think that that is a huge threat to home ownership. I would say that that would be the first.
And there's so many people who so desperately want to be homeowners. And I got to tell you, I even myself had to tap into my retirement when I was trying to pull together the down payment for the home that I purchased. So
exactly.
That's huge. Now, a lot of people don't understand this stuff, and I know some young people, some young adults who actually have gotten the message saying it's better to own than to rent, but they're still having problems. So I know that you in particular, early in your career, you served as a housing counselor.
Absolutely, yes.
So please, because people really want to become homeowners, can you tell us about what housing counseling is and the state of housing counseling today under the Trump administration?
I'm a major proponent of homebuyer education and housing counseling before people actually enter into the process. A lot of times people enter into homebuyer education and counseling as a means to get some type of assistance. It's usually a requirement for a lot of state and local money to get down payment assistance that you do attend housing counseling. But for the purposes of preservation and the sustainability of homeownership, it is better for someone to get that advisement and to get that information before they enter the process, because, what good is the information if you've already committed to buy a house or you've already entered into a contract and then find out information that would have been valuable for you to have had before you signed on the line. So it's imperative that housing counseling be a part of the strategy in buying a home. And not only because of the information, but because of the empowerment factor. It takes away a level of deferment that people in our community have, which creates a huge sense of anxiety. Particularly, Black folks were impacted by the housing crisis more than anyone. And we have to remember that today's home buyer, they're likely the child of someone who may have lost their home during the housing crisis. So there is a sense
of foreclosure is what you're saying. Maybe.
Yes, and the foreclosures that came. Some of these people who are buying houses were the children of people who entered or found themselves in foreclosure in 2008. So there's already a bit of PTSD that lives there with a lot of these buyers because they think that the system is rigged against them to begin with. So there is a level of empowerment that is given and endowed to buyers when they go into that process, because instead of going to their lender or to their realtor saying, what should I have? They can step into the transaction saying, this is what I want. It's a totally different mentality, and housing counseling allows them to have that advisor who can walk with them throughout the process, and also even after the process, should life start lifing like a pandemic. The same place that you went in order to get the information to buy the house is the same place that you can go if you find yourself in financial hardship in the future.
But with the Trump administration's budget that they sent to Congress, they are trying to zero out the housing counseling program.
Yes, and that is what the huge threat is. And being a former housing counselor, I can tell you with certainty that there are people who are at their very lowest, not only when they're facing some level of hardship. It doesn't even have to be financial. It could just be emotional. It could be a situation where someone has lost a spouse to a terminal disease, and now their spouse was the person who was the breadwinner or the person who was the decision maker, and now to become the person who is responsible for these household responsibilities feels like a burden that they can't carry. That is a perfect example of how housing counseling can help someone. And that's not a partisan issue, because people can lose their home in the breadbasket just like they can in any urban area. So housing counseling benefits everyone, and it's not just in purchasing a home, but it's in preservation. And we know ultimately, and we could talk about this a little later too, that housing finance policy is financial policy. If you don't preserve homes everywhere across the country, it will affect the bottom line of every bank that is in the country.
And the communities, right?
And the communities, absolutely.
Yeah. So obviously there have been incremental gains. We're not where we were in the 1920s, let's say, but there also have been setbacks, right, when it comes to home ownership. What systems or institutions do you think actually remain the biggest barriers to equitable access to credit and housing finance?
I think that's a great question. And I think that, of course, we've worked, in appraisal discrimination and having those conversations. We did that for a while. And there are conversations and arguments and debates on to what extent appraisal discrimination takes place, but even if it's 1%, there needs to be some remedy that addresses that.
But Julienne, tell folks exactly what appraisal discrimination is for folks who don't know.
So in appraisal discrimination, that is when the value of a property is disadvantaged because of the race of the owner or of the homeowner. So let's say, for example, there have been several examples that are in the news of properties being undervalued simply because the borrowers were Black. And then if they felt that the values were below what the neighborhood value would be, they in turn did a bit of an experiment to say, let me whitewash my home, meaning let me remove everything that's in my house that would identify me as a Black person, and I'm gonna replace it with artifacts in the house that would represent a white person's home. And get another appraiser to come in from a different company to do the same assessment using the same information, and it appraises higher. So it's significantly higher. In some instances, it was more than $200,000, I believe, in California. So that is what appraisal discrimination is. And, there's a lot of debate, like I said, about how much or to what extent that happens. But even if it's happening to one homeowner, that means that there needs to be some remedy in place in order to ensure that they have a voice in challenging that.
And this was a big deal. This was in the news and everything. And there was this task force. Tell us a little bit about the task force that was trying to attack this issue from a fair housing perspective.
Yes, the PAVE task force, which was actually chaired by our former HUD Secretary, Marsha L. Fudge. It was called PAVE, which was the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity Task Force. And it was solely focused on making sure that Black and brown borrowers were having some level of understanding of the government's means of recourse should there be any example of appraisal discrimination as a result of bias in that transaction. We looked at it from multiple perspectives, not only from the administrative perspective with the stroke of a pen based on the programmatic level. We looked at it from the rulemaking perspective, bringing interagency partners into play across the federal government to make sure that their perspectives and that their insights were included in the calculus on how we would address appraisal discrimination. Unfortunately, that is not a priority of the current administration, and we are hearing the rumblings of the dismantling of the PAVE task force, but lots of work was done there to ensure that consumers had some form of recourse if they felt or believed that appraisal discrimination was impacting the value of their home.
And I mean, obviously, appraisal discrimination impacts people who have become homeowners. But turning back to the folks who are not yet homeowners, my understanding is that HUD's Home Investment Partnership Program has actually played a role as it relates to homeownership by actually providing assistance to the states and local jurisdictions who can actually help eligible home buyers actually fund their homes that they want to buy, or maybe help rehabilitate them, because sometimes you do need money to keep it up, right?
Absolutely.
But here we are again with the fiscal 2026 proposed budget from the Trump administration that allocates $0 for this program, and then we've got similarly, we got this policy that really just kind of, what they say is your budget shows your priorities. You know what I mean? And so I know our team has been tracking the Trump's proposed budget cuts, even as it relates to another program. The Housing Choice Voucher Program has a homeownership program, right? There are currently, my team says, 9,500 active homeowner participants in that program. But here we are again with the fiscal 2026 proposed budget and appropriations talks going on right now, that's trying to also zero out these types of programs. So, I mean, these programs seem to be trying to help people, right? But they're not. And we've come a long way since there was Shelley v. Kramer, a fair housing case that LDF represented the litigants. That went up to the Supreme Court, right? Knocking down racial covenants, saying that courts cannot enforce racial covenants. Then we had the Fair Housing Act that I mentioned earlier from 1968. So how concerned are you about these efforts that are trying to dismantle housing protections, both on the funding side and from a fair housing discrimination side?
Absolutely. And, again, sadly, the presumption is the face of these folks, and we can take Section 8 first, is that the face of these folks is the presumption that they are Black and brown. But if you pull back the demographics and actually look at who is benefiting the most from housing choice vouchers, they are not Black and brown people, And what is crazy, and I just hint, we talked about this earlier in the conversation, is the fact that housing policy is financial policy. This is not a social safety net by providing housing choice vouchers, because if you remove them, if they believe that, all this is, these are people who are abusing, this is a welfare of some sort, we need to roll this back. Let's play that movie out a little bit, because you just said that there are 9,500 vouchers that are out there that are being utilized, right? So what we're
The homeownership program.
through
Yeah.
the homeownership program. But let's take it from the perspective of the landlords who are receiving outside of those 9,500. Let's talk about the vouchers, the hundreds of thousands of vouchers that are on the street right now from mom and pop landlords, from actual, from developers who are doing affordable housing and provide rental. If you remove those vouchers, guess what happens to those landlords? They then default on their mortgages. And guess what that does to the balance sheet of every bank in the country if they start to have distressed assets? Because you're not just hurting the tenant. So now you're creating displacement for the tenant, but you're also creating hardship for the owner. So now you are injecting the same variables that we found in the 2008 housing crisis.
And let me just plus up that one, because also we have in a lot of communities, we have vouchers submarkets, because there's certain neighborhoods are the only places that will take vouchers.
Absolutely.
So that means you're impacting the whole community.
You create a desert. Then you'll
Yeah.
create a rental desert. Now you're going to have a situation where you're going to have vacant properties that are blatant or blighted. And then you have an issue there. And now what do you do with those properties if you have a declining market? Then if somebody wants to come in there and lend, somebody's going to appraise it and say, well, you know what, this is a declining market. The values are going in the wrong direction. What lender will then want to put a homeowner or mortgage a property in a community that they say that the values are going south? No lender is going to choose to lend there. So there is so much more than, the concern of, are there people on the Section 8 program who are abusing it? To do that and to use that, the same analogy that we constantly hear about a hatchet instead of a scalpel, that if you have an issue with that, you can do that with policy. But what you don't do is starve the program, because ultimately that is a perfect recipe for another 2008 housing crisis by removing vouchers from the system.
And we certainly don't need that.
Absolutely.
So
Everyone loses. Everyone will lose.
So if a person actually has the funds to buy a home, right, there certainly is the barrier of housing discrimination no matter how much money you have, right?
Yes.
And so the Fair Housing Initiatives program, right? So by statute, they have historically, through this program, funded local entities like nonprofits to provide fair housing counseling, different than just housing counseling, but specifically fair housing counseling and investigations about discrimination. And, again, here we go, back to the fiscal 2026 budget suggestion is that be zeroed out. And goodness knows these nonprofits who have been working hard in these communities have actually dealt with the funding freeze issues as well, right? These are small nonprofits. And so there's a lot going on here as it relates to home ownership, fair housing. And I just can't help but think that if we are not active, and this includes people who are listening to this, in making sure that the appropriations from our Congress actually funds these programs, as I think, Julienne, you said, not only will it impact the individual participant, it will impact the private industry, because people are always talking about public-private partnerships, right? And impact communities. And so when we talk about communities, I can't help but think about this thing that the current Secretary Turner said, which was, and I'd like to get your reaction to this. I'm going to quote this too. He said, "We are cutting red tape to clear the way for more homes to be built. We have already eliminated the Biden era affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which, and this part kills me, which seized zoning powers from local leaders and placed them in the hands of federal bureaucrats." Well, first of all, they're seizing power from the locals by taking away the FIP funding. But this concept that the federal government was trying to become the zoning czars is beyond reality.
Because of course there's no bureaucracy in the federal government.
Beyond reality. And so, I just think that there's so much disinformation that it's just really important to say what the fact is and what the fact is not. And there was nothing about that rule that came out in June 2021, right at the beginning of the last administration, that kind of brought back some of the language from the Obama days, right?
Right.
As it relates to affirmatively furthering for housing, which is nothing more than making sure that communities are proactively looking at what the fair housing problems are and doing something about it, right? And I'm not sure that if that rule was telling communities to look at what's going on, how's that creating the federal government into becoming a zoning czar or whatever?
I have absolutely no idea. And the thing about it is this: the zoning still lives in local government and always will, regardless of whatever declaration is made, doesn't necessarily make it so. At the end of the day, the local zoning, that's always been the tension between federal and local government, is the fact that, of course, we want affordable housing to be accessible, we want it to be safe, and we want it to be swift. Nobody in any way, shape, or form challenges that.
Right.
But the tension has always been between the capacity of local government to get through the bureaucracy of their particular systems in order to do it. But just to say, hey, look, that as if AFFH is this barrier and would be preventing affordable housing to be built, I think is a red herring. I don't believe that that is the case. And I think that, there's a little bit of political theater that is taking place there. I'll leave that there. But the people who typically don't want to be mandated to do right are the people who absolutely are the reason why they need to be mandated to do what's right. Nobody pushes back. If you're already doing good, to mandate that good be done shouldn't offend you. Hit dogs holler, right? Hit dogs holler. So if you know that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing, that you are enforcing fair housing laws, that you are making sure that there isn't discrimination being taken in any of the processes, whether you're a developer, whether you're a renter, whether you're a lender. If you know that what you're doing is above board and is in compliance with the fair housing laws, being told to do so, you're gonna say, well, that's a very low bar. This is a test that I know I'm gonna pass, 8 out of the 7 days of the week. You know what I mean? So where's the problem? So to say that, I think is a bit of political theater. And everybody knows who really looked at that particular rule, which we both did. We know what that looks like. Understands that there is nothing in there that should be abrasive to anyone who believes in safe, affordable, accessible housing. And for anybody to say, I don't believe in safe, affordable, accessible housing, there's a deeper conversation that needs to be had there to see why they don't.
And I'll say, and in locations where people think their families could thrive, don't steer people to tell them where they're supposed to live. Let me switch gears here a little bit, and let's get a little more personal. Tell me what stories that you've experienced in your professional or personal lifetime, what stories actually still fuel your fire for the fight for racial equity in housing?
Absolutely. And I'm going to take it back to when I was a housing counselor at Neighborhood Housing Services of Baltimore, which I've served there right after the housing crisis. That was ground zero. I was very early in my career. I had just previously originated, and then of course the housing markets froze, but I knew I wanted to keep my thumb on the pulse of housing. So I decided to go to Baltimore and work in the consumer advocacy space. And that was ground zero. Baltimore was absolutely ground zero because we know at the time it already had its own housing and civil rights issues that have lingered for decades there. So, of course, the 2008 housing crisis only exacerbated what was already there for financial hardship. But to see Black people struggling the way that they were at the hands of a financial system that had failed them was what gave me my why for everything that I have done since that time. And there were people who came to us who said, literally looked at me in my face and said, Ms. Joseph, I will not see my children displaced. And when they said that, that meant if I lose my house, I will take my life. It was that serious. And there are people who ultimately did, only because they didn't have the resources or they came to us too late in the process in order for us to save their home. But what that did for me is reminded me that if at any point I had the opportunity to shape federal policy on a scale that could help the country, I would ensure that no person ever felt that way. And I always remembered the faces of those communities, those Black communities in Baltimore, where people had nowhere to go, they had nowhere to turn, they had no resources. And it reminded me of what it looks like when government fails people who are vulnerable, the most vulnerable among us, and lean on government in order to get the assistance that they deserve and that they are owed to have. And I carried that. So when I joined the administration in June of 21, in the middle of the pandemic, I leaned on that experience of being a housing counselor because we had 900,000 people who were not paying their mortgage. A lot of them were Black and brown. So what I remembered was the bureaucracy and the red tape that caused those people to unalive themselves during the course of the housing crisis in 2008. And that's how we determined that you need to fill out the phone book in order to get assistance. All you had to do was raise your hand and say, I'm struggling. I'm having a hard time. I've been impacted by the pandemic. And that was enough in order to get the wheels turning in order to save people. And I think that, the evidence is in the fact that we still have a housing industry that, yes, it has its challenges. We're working on affordability, but what we do not have is a black hole of inventory and distress and carnage in the housing industry that could have happened. And so to answer your question, Demetria, I lean on the fact that we are in positions, your listeners, the folks who are going to be watching this, are in positions to understand that every decision that we make impacts generations. That is a fact. 70 years ago, a Black family moving into a community was a declining market factor. That brought the value down if a Black family moved into a neighborhood. That's in our parents' lifetime. That's not long ago.
No, not at all.
So when we think about those things and we see what happens when government fails folks and it fails to remedy the wrongs and the ills of how the country has treated underserved communities, it is upon us to figure out how we can mitigate those losses that have taken place.
Well, that's sobering, Julienne. That's really sobering. If you had a magic wand and you could pick any one policy tomorrow to kind of shift the trajectory of home ownership for Black communities, what would that be?
I would say that there needs to be support of special purpose credit programs because they're real.
What is a special purpose?
Special purpose again, look, thank you for reminding me. I'm still speaking governmentese. A special purpose credit program is assistance that is tailored toward an underserved community. That is when, a lender or a bank will create certain financial assistance in order to address a particular barrier or need of a group or a cohort. So we understand that redlining was a very real thing and still exists in more, macro forms right now. It happens, and it can be more subtle. It can be, masked in a different form. It can be in the form of an exorbitant, homeowners association fee. It can be buried in an expensive condo association fee that stops you from getting into a building that you can afford the mortgage, but you can't afford the association fee, and there's no justification of why it's astronomical. These things still happen. It is a reality that it happens across our country, and it is intentional. It is deliberate that those things happen. But I believe that as we started the conversation, that generational wealth is the albatross around the neck of Black communities. That is what has prevented our community from being able to thrive in the homeownership space is cash. It is still king. At the end of the day, you need money in order to make money. And if there are not resources there to even get you approved, then we have folks who are constantly going to be paying into a system that won't pay them back. So special purpose credit programs are the ones that would be tailored for folks, whether it's your race, ethnicity, or your gender. There are things that are in place for communities that are being negatively impacted, and I think special purpose credit programs are necessary in addition to down payment assistance. Down payment assistance is a rising tide floats all boats, policy, but special purpose credit programs within the confines of down payment assistance would be beneficial to Black and Brown communities who desperately need access to those funds in order to have an equitable chance at homeownership.
And clearly, the systemic barriers of the past and those that have been perpetuated and the systemic barriers of today all impact this economic justice issue that we're talking about here. Absolutely. That plays out in terms of people's housing, even not just home ownership, but also in the rental market as well. And I just can't stress enough for folks who are listening how important it is for folks to get involved. Even if it's just picking up the phone and contacting your congressional member at 202-224-3121. Again, that phone number is 202-224-3121. You don't have to know the name of a congressperson. Just call that number and you'll get connected to your right congressperson so that you can say, hey, I'm concerned about the fiscal 2026 appropriations, and I think these programs need to be funded. That's our position here at LDF as we try to fight for the dignity, folks, the dignity of Black communities. And so thank you, Julienne, for joining me today.